Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Ben Lazarus, the magazine's special projects editor. Overnight, the Iranians fired 181 ballistic missiles at Israel, and there are fears that the situation could gravely escalate. To discuss this, I'm joined by the Middle East correspondent at The Economist, Gregg Carlstrom. Greg, great to have you with us this morning. Last night was the second time that Iran has targeted Israel directly, the first time obviously being in April earlier this year. Could you just talk us through the developments of the last 24, 48 hours that saw Iran launch this attack?
The Iranians are saying that this was retaliation for three deaths, for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, back in July in Tehran, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, about a week ago, less than a week ago, and the killing of an Iranian Revolutionary Guard general who was with Nasrallah in his bunker at the time of that assassination. And so the Iranians are saying they packaged all three of those together, and this strike in which they fired 181 ballistic missiles at Israel, they're saying it was retaliation for those three deaths.
Now, obviously, a retaliation was expected at some point. I mean, when they did the assassination in Tehran of Haniyeh, it was expected that Iran might respond then. So in many senses, this has been a long time coming. But were you surprised at the scale of the response yesterday?
I was surprised by the scale of it. I think a lot of people were surprised that the Iranians did it at all. They had been saying, as you say, that there would be some retaliation for Haniyeh at some point. But such a long time had gone by that I think many people believed Iran wasn't interested in directly striking at Israel again. They did that, of course, back in April when their consulate at Damascus was bombed and several officers from the Revolutionary Guard were killed. And the strike they carried out in April was seen as somewhat performative. It was announced well in advance. It started with these slow-moving drones that took hours to reach Israel. It didn't seem like something that really restored deterrence. It was seen more as symbolic than restoring deterrence. And I think in the wake of that, the Iranians realized that their ability to strike at Israel was somewhat limited, and it wasn't something that they wanted to make a habit of doing. They much preferred to fight through their proxies, as they have done for many, many years now. But I think with what has happened to Hezbollah over the past couple of weeks, the very, very tough blows that it has suffered at the hands of Israel, I think there was an argument within the IRGC that Iran was losing deterrence, that its proxies weren't working anymore, and it had to do something directly. It had no choice but to do something directly.
And to what extent do you see this attack as also performative, or do you think the goalposts have changed somewhat from the attack in April?
I think it's very different from the attack in April. It only used ballistic missiles. It didn't use those slow-moving drones or comparatively slow-moving cruise missiles. It was just ballistic missiles, which take about 12 minutes to reach Israel. And so there's not much lead time here. It wasn't announced days in advance. I think they did tip off the Iraqis, who then tipped off the Americans a couple of hours beforehand. But there wasn't the long lead time that we saw in April, where America was able to set up this ad hoc coalition of Western and Arab states to jump to Israel's defense. And so I think firing a large barrage of fast-moving missiles on relatively short notice, it was intended to do some damage to the what the Iranians say were three Israeli air bases and the headquarters of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. Those were the stated targets of the attack. I think it was meant to inflict damage. It was meant to try and be a deterrent against future Israeli attack.
And obviously, we know that the attack wasn't particularly successful. Many of the missiles were shot down, and only one civilian was killed, a Palestinian man in the West Bank. So to what extent will Iran see this as a victory? And how's it sort of been perceived in the Arab world? And how might that shape Iran's thinking about their next steps?
I think they'll see it as a propaganda victory, even though, as you say, most of these don't seem to have caused much damage. Many of them were shot down. There was all of this dramatic footage on social media last night of missiles streaking through the sky, some of them impacting in Israel, either full missiles or fragments of missiles that had been intercepted, crashing down, leaving craters, starting fires in Israel. And this footage was widely shared in Iran and across the Arab world. And there were a lot of people who saw this as a serious Iranian attack on Israel. There was also a lot of misinformation going around that the Iranians were helping to promote. There were incorrect reports that, for example, dozens of Israel's F-35 fighter jets had been blown up on the ground by these Iranian missiles. And so they're using this for PR purposes, I think, somewhat effectively at home and across the region. But I think the more pragmatic officials within Iran are going to recognize that this wasn't very effective at imposing deterrence on Israel, and it's likely to now invite, I think, a very strong Israeli response.
And that leads me nicely on to the next question. How do you see the Israeli response playing out now?
I think it's almost inevitable that there will be some direct Israeli attack on Iran, and not what we saw in April, where they fired, I think it was a single missile at an Iranian air defense system in the city of Esfahan, something that was a bit deniable, something that the Iranians were able to almost pretend didn't happen. The mood in Israel right now is very much in favor of doing something bigger, doing something very overt. There has been talk of striking at Iran's nuclear facilities or striking at Iran's oil export facilities. Something like that obviously would be very public and very hard to hide. And I think for the Israelis, it's not just that this was a bigger attack from Iran and they feel the need to impose their own deterrence, but it's also the broader mood right now in Israel after a couple of weeks of successful tactical operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. There's a sort of euphoria that has set in within the political and security establishment in Israel. There's a feeling that they have Hezbollah on the back foot. Why not press that advantage even further and go after Iran directly? And so I think the strike may give them the obviously the justification to do that.
And in terms of a timescale, when do you see the Israeli response likely happening?
That's very hard to say. I think one question is whether it's going to be a unilateral Israeli response or whether they're going to try to enlist the help of the Americans in this. If the goal is to strike at Iran's nuclear facilities, at this point, Israel doing that unilaterally is of very limited effectiveness. When you ask Israeli army officers, they'll tell you, given how hardened Iran's nuclear facilities are, many of them are underground or dug into the sides of mountains, Israel would be able to inflict fairly limited damage, and it might at best set back Iran's nuclear work, by a matter of months. In the process, it's going to give Iran a justification to accelerate that nuclear work and to pursue a nuclear bomb. So if you want to deal meaningful damage, if you want to set that program back perhaps by a number of years, that requires doing it in concert with the United States, which obviously has much greater capability than Israel does. But that is going to take some time to secure, if they can secure it. And I'm sure there will be a lot of people in America who are nervous about the idea of getting involved in a direct strike on Iran.
But could you see America supporting such a strike? I mean, in April, Biden advised Netanyahu to take the win, whereas the mood music perhaps seems slightly different now. I mean, Antony Blinken warned yesterday of, quote, severe consequences for Tehran. So does it seem like the mood in Washington now might be to back Israel in doing such an attack?
It is. I mean, I think there are people who are nervous about it, but yes, there are people within the administration, Blinken, Jake Sullivan, who, based on their public comments, do seem inclined to support an Israeli response. And I think what we've seen time and again over the past year is the Americans setting red lines, or the Americans insisting that particular Israeli actions would be a mistake, would court disaster if the Israelis did them. The Israelis have done them, and then the Americans have turned around and said, well, actually, we supported this privately all along. So they really have not been willing to push back on anything the Netanyahu government has wanted to do over the past year. And I think now there might be more inclination than you would have expected 6 months ago or a year ago to join in some kind of retaliatory action.
And how dangerous a moment do you see this being? I mean, some of these sort of Israeli policy seems to have been to escalate to de-escalate. Certainly that seems to be the case with Hezbollah in Lebanon. But there's a danger, of course, that the more you escalate, you can miscalculate and your gamble can backfire. Could you see a situation where Israel retaliates now and they essentially launch, all-out war with Tehran?
I mean, there's always a risk of things continuing to escalate, but I think the bind that the Iranians are in is, for many, many years, Hezbollah was their first line of defense against Israeli attack. The fact that they had what was thought to be this incredibly formidable fighting force on Israel's northern border, outfitted with tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles, well-trained fighters who could mount cross-border raids. That was the thing that prevented Israel from striking Iran, the fear that Iran would then activate Hezbollah. What's happened over the past month is Iran seems to have lost, at least temporarily, that line of defense. Hezbollah is in disarray. Their military command has been wiped out. Some significant chunk of their arsenal has been destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. They're not in a position to launch that sort of major assault on Israel. And so the Israelis might feel, if they attack Iran, Iran could retaliate again with a barrage of ballistic missiles, but it only has a limited number of those missiles with the range to reach Israel. And so at some point, it's not going to be in a position to escalate further vis-a-vis Israel. I think the other concern in the region is that Iran and its allies might strike out horizontally. Instead of escalating the conflict with Israel, they might, for example, strike at Gulf states. And there have been some warnings coming from the Revolutionary Guard in the past 12 hours or so that if Israel or America were to strike at Iran's oil facilities, they would do the same in the Gulf. They would strike at Saudi or Emirati oil facilities, which would obviously be incredibly disruptive to global energy supplies. Now, the Israelis and the Americans might be inclined to call their bluff on that, but the Gulf states are going to be very nervous about that. And so they're going to be pushing, again, both Israel and the US, I think, to show some restraint. So that's also a concern here. It's not just the war between Israel and Iran getting bigger, it's also the war expanding even further.
Just going back to Hezbollah for a second, were you surprised at how easily the Israelis seem to dismantle parts of their infrastructure and take out their high command?
I was, and just about everyone I know in Lebanon was. This is a group that had a reputation for being competent, for being not just an effective fighting force, but also for being a very cohesive organization whose members were quite committed to the cause. And I think for me and many others to see just how deeply penetrated it is by Israel came as somewhat of a shock. Now, why are they penetrated that way? That's a question that we may not know for a while. I think some of it has to do with Hezbollah having spent the better part of the past decade fighting in Syria. It had to recruit a lot more men to go fight in Syria to prop up the Assad regime there. It has had to work quite closely with the Syrian government, which is notoriously corrupt, with the Iranian government, which we know to be shot through with Israeli agents. And so that may have given Israel more opportunities to penetrate the organization than it would have otherwise had if Hezbollah had just been confined to Lebanon and focused on fighting Israel, which was what it traditionally did.
And historically, when Israel has invaded Lebanon, these things have never been quick or smooth for that matter. Do you think the Israelis are going to get quite bogged down in southern Lebanon? I mean, just this morning, they've sent more troops over there. How do you see this sort of conflict on their northern border playing out?
I think it's a very real concern that mission creep sets in here. I mean, if we take at face value that the stated goal of this invasion is to clear military infrastructure from the border, from a few kilometers along the border, troops will go in, they will destroy bunkers, tunnels, things that Hezbollah has been building up for many, many years. And then let's say they leave. At that point, there's nothing to prevent Hezbollah from coming back to southern Lebanon, trying to reestablish a presence there, and a presence that it could then use to continue threatening residents of northern Israel who've been displaced for almost a year. So the army might then be tempted to keep some troops in Lebanon, at least to occupy advantageous bits of terrain, high ground along the border. But if it does that, those troops become a target. Their outposts become targets. And so you'll want to send more troops to protect those troops. You take the first hill and then you need to take the second hill in order to protect the first hill, and so on and so forth. And so I think there is a real concern that the end goal of this is to create the conditions in which 60,000 people can go back to their homes in northern Israel. It's very hard to see how you do that through military means alone, unless the goal is to permanently occupy a strip of land. And if you do that, then you are bogged down in another, perhaps very lengthy misadventure in Lebanon.
And one thing that isn't covered very much is the fact that Hezbollah have a huge tunnel network, just similar to Hamas does or did in Gaza. Would that present some quite difficult combat issues for the Israelis?
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Combat issues and even just logistical issues. I mean, in terms of combat, of course, we've seen this time and again in Gaza. These are confined spaces, they're dangerous spaces, difficult spaces to fight in. But they're also just incredibly time-consuming spaces where if you want to destroy a tunnel, you have to map that tunnel, you have to find out where the shafts of that tunnel are, you have to seal those shafts, and every time you have to do that, that is not just the work of a few moments. That is something that takes hours or days, and it ties up a number of combat engineers and other specialized troops. And so the Israelis in Gaza trying to close off the entrances to hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, they've been working on that for the better part of a year now, and they say they've only been able to close a fraction of the Hamas tunnel network in Gaza. Even if it's not as extensive, perhaps in South Lebanon, it's not something that the Israelis will be able to do quickly.
With Nasrallah out of the picture now, how quickly will Hezbollah be able to sort of regroup and reform with the new leadership?
I think it will pick a new leader quite quickly. Hashem Safi is likely to be that new leader. He's a cousin of Nasrallah's. He's related by marriage to Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general who America assassinated in 2020. So he's a bit like royalty within the movement. He's close to Iran. And he's seen as someone who is quite hawkish, is perhaps even more hawkish than Nasrallah. He is likely to be, or he is at least at the moment, the front runner to be the next leader. But I think the question isn't just appointing a new secretary general. The issue that they're going to have is they have lost centuries of military experience over the past 2 months. They have lost the entire first and second tiers of their military leadership, with one or two exceptions, have been assassinated in Israeli strikes. So how can you replace that? That is not something that you can just substitute in some younger guys on short notice. And I think that's likely to be the issue going forward, is there's a vacuum of leadership, of military leadership at the top. This is also taking place at a time where their communications networks have been disrupted by these pager and walkie-talkie attacks, where they're fighting a war against Israeli troops now in southern Lebanon. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to try and reestablish command and control and to try and replace the expertise and the leadership that they lost.
Hezbollah is obviously one part of the Iranian axis of resistance. How weakened does that resistance now look after a year of a war in Gaza? Hezbollah suffering as they have in the last few months, the assassination in Tehran of Haniyeh. I mean, how weak does Iran now look on the world stage, do you think?
It's taken a very significant blow. I mean, it does have all of these militias, but Hezbollah was always first among equals in these militias. It was by far the best equipped. It has the largest arsenal of rockets and missiles and the most advanced rockets and missiles. It has extensive combat expertise from its years of fighting along the Assad regime in Syria. It was the group that trained many of these other militias. Hezbollah advisors have gone to Yemen, for example, to train the Houthis in Yemen and to advise them on how to make weapons and to advise them on tactics and strategy. So it was really the linchpin of this Iranian axis. And for its leadership to have been decapitated in a very short span of time, I think is going to have an impact on the other groups within that axis, especially because it comes after Qasem Soleimani's assassination. A lot of people you talk to in the region say Iran's leadership of these groups never recovered. Soleimani was a charismatic, influential, very effective commander. Ismail Qani, his replacement, is not thought to be that effective. And so Nasrallah had actually been the de facto leader of this so-called axis of resistance, and losing him is going to be, I think, a big blow to Iran's ability to project power across the region.
And how much do you think the US election is shaping Iran's thinking now? I mean, is it possible they might wait and see who ends up in the White House? I mean, if it's Donald Trump, they might be much more wary of doing anything to rock the sort of global order, but perhaps a Kamala Harris presidency might give them more of an opportunity to be more emboldened.
I think everyone is waiting for the outcome of the election right now. I think on the Israeli side, Netanyahu has spent months hoping that Donald Trump comes back to power and probably doesn't mind the fact that the specter of a bigger war in the Middle East right now might help Trump. It might hurt Harris because she is associated with, obviously, the Biden administration's policies. I think for the Iranians, they probably prefer the opposite outcome. I mean, we have a new president in Iran who was inaugurated just 3 months ago, who has been trying to reach out to the West, who is interested in brokering some kind of a nuclear deal. That was the talk a week or two ago, and he was at the UN before Nasrallah's assassination, before much of this happened. He was meeting with American and European officials to try and talk about ways to revive or revise the 2015 nuclear agreement. So, yeah, I think both sides are going to be waiting to see the outcome of the election, perhaps, before they decide on longer term policy.
But even the events of last night would suggest that any attempts by the new president of Iran to reenact the P5 nuclear deal, presumably that's now dead in the water.
I think the question is, how far are the Iranians willing to go with this conflict against Israel? If the Israelis, they have threatened, if the Israelis strike back after last night's ballistic missile barrage, that there will be more Iranian retaliation. But again, I think the dynamics of escalation here, they're in Israel's favor. Israel has more ability to do damage to Iran at the moment than Iran has to do damage to Israel. And so I think what they would really like to do, the Iranians, is find some way to make a deal. They have been talking in recent days about their nuclear program as if it's something that they want to swap at the moment. And they've been using some different language about their nuclear program. The foreign minister, for example, after meeting with European officials last week, he said an agreement is the only way to ensure that Iran's nuclear program remains peaceful. The Iranians have spent decades insisting that their program is peaceful, that it has no military applications whatsoever. They're now coming around to admitting that actually there is a military component to this, that it is to at least reach the threshold where they could develop enough fissile material for a nuclear bomb. And so I think they're in a position right now where they're trying to use that as leverage. They're trying to use the specter of dashing to a bomb now that their conventional deterrents in the region, their proxies, seem to have failed. They want to sort of frighten America and Europe into believing that they're about to dash for a bomb, and they therefore have one last opportunity to make a nuclear deal. I think there is still a window of opportunity for that, but I think it depends on how far Israel is willing to go with its retaliatory strikes, and then whether Iran is willing to, at some point, get off this escalatory ladder and try to make a deal.
Talking of escalatory ladders, do you see many off-ramps for any of the actors involved here?
It's very hard to imagine what those would be, honestly. For a long time, what we've all been saying is the path to a broader ceasefire in the region starts in Gaza. And an agreement between Israel and Hamas in Gaza that frees hostages, that ends the fighting there, would also calm down Israel's northern border, and it would calm all of these other fronts in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And I'm not sure that holds anymore. I think given that Israel has now seriously escalated its fighting in Lebanon, has invaded Lebanon, I'm not sure it sees those two conflicts as linked anymore. It actually wants to de-link those two conflicts. I'm not sure it has much incentive to make a ceasefire in Gaza at this point. I think Netanyahu has calculated that he's probably past the high water mark of pressure around the hostages, the 101 Israeli hostages who are still being held there. He has survived that being a salient political issue in Israel, and he can continue to rebuff calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. And then I think there's this now direct Israeli-Iranian conflict that also is de-linked from Gaza. So if that path doesn't work anymore, if it's not start in Gaza and then you can calm the rest of the region, how do you do that? I mean, one way to do it is to have some kind of diplomatic agreement in Lebanon that would bring the Lebanese army back to the southern border, perhaps with an international peacekeeping force but one that actually works, not UNIFIL, which is basically just an observer force that has no power in South Lebanon. It would have to be something much stronger than UNIFIL, something that really had the authority to keep Hezbollah away from the southern border. I think the Israeli government at some point would be willing to go for an agreement like that. The question is, how do you do that? What is this force that's going to go into Lebanon and enforce that separation on the border? I'm not really sure who's going to do that.
And with all the focus on Iran and Lebanon, what's going on in Gaza and how's that playing out currently?
The war is still grinding on, but it's stalemated, I would say, at this point. The Israelis have been stuck in this pattern for months where they go into an area, they fight Hamas in that area, they say they've cleared that area, and then they leave and they go and they do that somewhere else. And once they leave, Hamas comes back into that area. There's still no alternative. The Israelis have refused to even discuss any kind of alternative political arrangement, bringing back the Palestinian Authority, for example, or some kind of peacekeeping force. Netanyahu isn't interested in talking about that. He's not interested in a ceasefire at the moment, in part because his far-right coalition partners are not interested in one, are still harboring dreams of one day rebuilding the Israeli settlements in Gaza and reoccupying it. And then on the other side, you have Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, who is also not interested in making a deal, who thinks that a long war ultimately will be to his benefit because it will damage international views of Israel. It will hurt Israel's standing. It will hurt the Israeli economy. It will drag Israel into a seemingly endless quagmire. So the leaders on both sides don't want to end the war right now. And the Israeli government has no plan for sort of what arrangements it wants to make in Gaza going forward. And so the war is just stuck in this awful loop with unbearable consequences for 2 million people who have been displaced for almost a year in Gaza and are living in just intolerable conditions.
Benjamin Netanyahu is usually accused of acting purely in his own self-interest. The developments of the last week or two with Israel taking on Hezbollah in Lebanon and potentially escalating things with Iran, do you see that as purely political self-interest and Netanyahu in survival mode, or do you think he's acting in the interests of the Israeli state?
He has broad support for these actions from other politicians, from other notable figures in Israel, even people who are his critics, who have been very critical of him around Gaza for the better part of this year. There is widespread support in Israel for what he's doing in Lebanon, not just because it ostensibly is to bring 60,000 people back to their homes in the north, but also because I think it has reversed this feeling of despair that set in after October 7th. Israelis feel like their army and their security forces are sort of back to their old days, back to the old days of glory. And there are people making comparisons to the 1967 war, to how Israel destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the tarmac, suggesting that it's done something similar with the leadership of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So there is broad support for it. That being said, it does help Netanyahu politically. The polls that have come out over the past few days, and there's not many of them, but a handful of polls that have come out, his personal favorable ratings have gone up. When people are asked, who do you think should be the next prime minister? His numbers have gone up. That's been going on for months, actually. He's been, in a way that no one would have thought possible on October 7th of last year, he's been able to somewhat revive his political fortunes. And I think what he's doing in Lebanon at the moment will continue to help, as long as Israel doesn't get bogged down in a very bloody quagmire with this ground invasion. But I think the problem that Netanyahu has is that even though it's helping him a bit right now, people still haven't forgotten all of the reasons that they were angry with him, that they wanted him gone a year ago or even before October 7th. His efforts to overhaul the Israeli judiciary, his elevation of the far right in his current government, presiding over, of course, the biggest security failure in half a century. And so even though his personal numbers have ticked up a bit, he is still not in a position, it looks like, in the polls where he would be able to form the next government. There is still a majority of Israeli voters who are going for anti-Netanyahu parties. So he does have a bit of a new lease on life. It's possible that he will remain in power now until 2026, until the next scheduled election. But it is still hard to imagine that he is going to come out of that next election as the next Prime Minister of Israel.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, thank you.